In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there are warriors who have served the Emperor for longer than most civilizations have existed. They are the ancient Dreadnoughts, entombed within walking sarcophagi of adamantium and ceramite, their broken bodies sustained by arcane life support systems that date back to the dark age of technology. These warriors have fought in battles that younger space marines know only as legends. They have witnessed the rise and fall of entire sectors. Some among them walked Terra's soil when the Emperor himself still strode among his people, when the Primarchs were more than myths, and when the Imperium was young and full of terrible promise. Yet when these ancients awaken from their centuries-long slumber, when chapter masters and librarians gather to hear the wisdom of ages past, there is one subject these veterans will not discuss. Ask them about the Horus heresy, and they will speak, though their voices crack with mechanical sorrow. Question them about the Great Crusade, and they will share tales of glory and conquest across the stars. But ask them to describe Terra as it was before the unification, to paint a picture of the cradle of humanity in those dark days before the Emperor's rise, and you will be met with silence. A silence so profound, so absolute, that it speaks of horrors greater than any Xenos threat or chaos incursion. This is not the silence of forgotten memories, though the passage of millennia has certainly eroded much of what these ancient warriors once knew. This is not the confusion of minds fractured by the psychological trauma of dreadnought entombment, though such confusion is common enough among those who have served too long. No, this is a deliberate silence, a choice made by warriors who have seen things that the Imperium of the 41st millennium was never meant to know. It is the silence of those who understand that some truths are more dangerous than any weapon, more corrosive than the touch of chaos itself. To understand why these ancient warriors refuse to speak of Terra's past, we must first understand what they are, what they have become, and the terrible price they pay for their eternal service. The walking tombs. The process of becoming a dreadnought is not an honor, despite what the chaplains and the propaganda servitors might tell the common citizens of the Imperium. It is a last resort, a desperate measure taken when a space marine's body has been so catastrophically damaged that even the phenomenal regenerative abilities of the Astartes' physiology cannot save them. When a warrior's spine has been shattered, when their organs have been liquefied by plasma fire, when their limbs have been torn away and their chest cavity crushed beyond any hope of reconstruction, the apothecaries face a grim choice. They can grant the warrior the Emperor's peace, a quick death that honors their sacrifice and allows their gene seed to be harvested for the next generation. Or they can condemn that warrior to an existence that stretches on for centuries, possibly millennia, sealed within a walking tomb of metal and ceramite. The surgery itself is a brutal affair, one that would kill any normal human and tests even the resilience of a space marine. What remains of the warrior's body is stripped down to its most essential components. Arms and legs, already destroyed, are removed entirely. The torso is carved away until only the vital organs remain, suspended in a preservation matrix. The warrior's head may be retained, or it too may be reduced to just the brain and sensory organs, depending on the extent of the injuries and the particular practices of the chapter. What emerges from this butchery is something that barely qualifies as human anymore, a biological component that exists only to operate the war machine into which it has been integrated. This remnant of flesh and bone is then sealed within an armored sarcophagus filled with amniotic fluid that is thick as oil and cold enough to burn. Neural interface cables pierce directly into what remains of the spine and skull, creating a connection so complete that the warrior's consciousness becomes one with the machine. The pilot no longer has eyes to see with, but optical sensors that feed data directly into the visual cortex. They no longer have hands to feel with, but pressure sensors that translate contact with the outside world into electrical impulses. Every sensation is filtered through layers of technology, creating an experience that is fundamentally alien to anything the warrior knew in their former life. And then comes the true horror. The Dreadnought systems are miraculous in their preservation capabilities, able to sustain what little organic matter remains for centuries beyond any natural lifespan. But the human mind, even the enhanced mind of a space marine, was never meant to endure such an existence. Extended neural interface with a machine as large and complex as a dreadnought creates immense mental stress. The sensation of being something so massive, so heavy, so fundamentally different from a human form, slowly erodes the pilot's sense of self. Time begins to lose meaning when you spend decades or centuries in stasis sleep, awakened only for the most desperate battles. Memories blur and fade, the past and present becoming confused in a mind that struggles to maintain coherence across the vast gulfs of time. This is why the tech priests and chaplains keep the ancient ones in stasis between battles, why they allow these warriors to sleep away the centuries in darkness. It is presented as a mercy, a way to preserve the pilot's sanity by sparing them from the passage of time when they are not needed. But the truth, whispered only in the deepest vaults of the apothecarian, is darker. The stasis is not truly to preserve the pilot's mind. It is to delay the inevitable deterioration, to extract a few more centuries of service before the organic component within the sarcophagus finally loses all coherence and becomes nothing more than a semi-conscious biological processor, still capable of fighting, but no longer truly aware of what it is or why it battles. Some pilots embrace this dissolution. They welcome the slow erosion of memory and personality, seeing it as a release from the burden of consciousness. Others fight against it with every fiber of their being, clinging desperately to memories of who they once were, even as those memories slip away like water through grasping fingers. And a rare few, the strongest, or perhaps the most stubborn, manage to maintain their sense of self across the millennia, paying for that continuity with a burden of memory that no mind should have to bear. The Dreadnoughts of the 41st millennium come in many patterns and configurations. The most common is the Castroferrum pattern, a blocky, functional design that has been the backbone of Astartes' armored support for thousands of years. But there are older patterns still in service, relics from the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. The Contemptor pattern, sleeker and more advanced than its successors, incorporating technologies that the Mechanicum can no longer reproduce. The Leviathan pattern, a monster of a machine that was built in secret on Terra itself, incorporating systems that date back to the dark age of technology and inflicting such strain on its pilot that madness is all but guaranteed. These ancient patterns are often piloted by the oldest warriors, those who were interred during the heresy or even before, and who have somehow survived the passage of 10,000 years. Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves is perhaps the most famous of these ancient warriors. He fought alongside Leman Russ himself during the Great Crusade. He witnessed the burning of Prospero and the treachery that would tear the Imperium apart. After his Primarch's disappearance, he became the first Great Wolf, leading his chapter for years before his own grievous wounding saw him interred within a dreadnought. That was over 10,000 years ago. Since then, he has been awakened periodically, usually once per century, to share his wisdom with the younger Space Wolves and to answer questions about the chapter's history and traditions. But even Bjorn, for all his willingness to share stories of Russ and the Great Crusade, falls silent when asked about certain subjects. He will not speak of the Emperor's private conversations with his Primarch, claiming that such matters are not for the ears of later generations. He will not discuss the exact circumstances that led Russ to depart for the Eye of Terra, beyond saying that the Wolf King had his reasons, and that they must remain between Russ and the Emperor. And he will absolutely not describe what Terra was like before the unification, before the Emperor's rise, before the techno-barbarian empires were brought to heel. Why this silence? Why do warriors who have proven their loyalty across 10 millennia refuse to speak of the Imperium's origins? To answer that, we must understand what they remember and what that knowledge means for the carefully constructed mythology that sustains the Imperium of man in the 41st millennium. Memories that span millennia. The memories of an ancient dreadnought are not like the memories of ordinary humans, or even ordinary space marines. They exist in fragments, some crystal clear and others hopelessly muddled, scattered across centuries of stasis sleep and battle. A dreadnought might remember the face of a brother who fell in battle with perfect clarity, able to recall every detail of their features, the timbre of their voice, the way they moved in combat. But that same dreadnought might be completely unable to remember when that battle took place, or what world it was fought on, or even which enemy they were facing. The passage of time becomes meaningless when you spend centuries asleep and awake only for brief periods of slaughter. This fragmentation is exacerbated by the physical deterioration of the organic components within the sarcophagus. The preservation technology is remarkable, but it is not perfect. Slowly, inexorably, the neural tissue degrades. Synaptic connections that held memories begin to fail. The amniotic fluid can preserve the body, but it cannot stop the slow accumulation of cellular damage that eventually claims all living things. Some memories simply disappear, lost to the ravages of time and physical decay. Others become confused, bleeding together until the pilot can no longer be certain what they truly remember and what they have constructed from the fragments that remain. And yet, despite all of this, certain memories persist with extraordinary clarity. Combat memories, in particular, seem to be almost indelible. The sensation of firing a lascannon at an enemy vehicle, the vibration as an assault cannon cycles through its ammunition, the impact of a power fist crushing through armor plating. These experiences are burned into the pilot's consciousness, reinforced by the neural interface that translates thought into action and sensation into data. A dreadnought might forget the names of brothers they served with for centuries, but they will remember every detail of the battles they fought, every kill they made, every moment of violence with a clarity that would drive a normal human insane. This selective preservation of memory is not random. It is a function of how the dreadnought systems interact with the pilot's consciousness. The neural interface is designed primarily for combat, for translating the pilot's tactical awareness and fighting instincts into the movements of the machine. Memories that are relevant to combat, that help the pilot function as a weapon, are reinforced and preserved by the very systems that keep them alive. Memories that have no direct tactical application, that speak only of who the pilot was before their entombment, these fade more quickly, deemed unnecessary by the cold logic of the machine spirit. But there is another category of memory, one that resists both the erosion of time and the selective pressure of the dreadnought systems. These are the memories that carry the heaviest emotional weight, the experiences that define the pilot as a person rather than a warrior. For some, these might be memories of their primarch, of the day they first met the gene father of their legion and swore their loyalty. For others, they might be memories of pivotal moments in the Horus heresy, of watching brothers turn traitor, or of witnessing the fall of worlds they had fought to liberate. And for the very oldest, those who were born on Terra itself, or who served in the unification wars, these memories are of the cradle of humanity before it was united, before it was sanitized and mythologized by the Imperium that followed. These ancient dreadnoughts are vanishingly rare in the 41st millennium. Most who survived the Horus heresy fell in the scouring that followed, or in the countless wars of the 10,000 years since. Those who remain are treasured relics, living connections to a past that grows more distant with each passing century. They are awakened only in the most dire circumstances, when their wisdom is absolutely necessary, or when the enemy is so terrible that even the risk of losing such an invaluable asset must be accepted. When these ancients do awaken, they often experience profound disorientation. The world they remember, the Imperium they helped to build, bears little resemblance to what the Imperium has become. The Emperor, who they knew as a living, breathing being who walked among his warriors and led them in person, is now worshipped as a god, despite his own prohibition against such veneration. The Primarchs, their gene fathers who commanded legions and conquered star systems, are either dead, vanished, or transformed into demon princes. The Space Marine legions, those vast armies that prosecuted the Great Crusade, have been broken up into chapters of 1,000 warriors each. Everything they fought to build has been twisted by time and necessity into something they barely recognize. This disorientation is compounded by the gaps in their memory. They might remember the Great Crusade with perfect clarity, but have no recollection of what happened in the centuries immediately after the heresy. They might remember their Primarch vividly, but have forgotten the names and faces of the brothers who served alongside them. The past is present to them in a way that the recent past is not, creating a kind of temporal vertigo where events separated by millennia feel equally close, while events from only a few centuries ago are lost in fog. And through it all, running like a dark thread through the fabric of their memories, are the things they saw on Terra, the things they did during the Unification Wars, when the Emperor was still just a warlord among many, and the future of humanity hung in the balance. The things they witnessed in the last days before the Great Crusade, when the Imperium was being forged in blood and fire, and the imperial truth was being imposed at the point of a bolter. These memories have not faded. If anything, they have only grown sharper with time, polished by repetition until every detail is crystal clear, a clarity that makes them all the more terrible to recall. Terror before the fall. To understand what these ancient warriors remember, we must first understand what Terra had become by the end of the Age of Strife. The cradle of humanity, the birth world of the species that would one day claim dominion over 1,000,000 worlds, had been reduced to a charnel house, a poisoned wasteland where the remnants of humanity waged endless war against each other in the ruins of their ancestors' greatest achievements. The Age of Strife had lasted for thousands of years, a period of complete regression and fragmentation that followed the collapse of humanity's first interstellar civilization. The exact causes of this collapse are now lost to history, deliberately obscured by the administratum and the ecclesiarchy, who prefer that the common citizens of the Imperium not dwell too deeply on the failures of the past. But the results were catastrophic. Warp storms rendered travel between star systems impossible, severing the trade routes and communication networks that had bound human colonies together. Isolated systems fell prey to Xeno's predators, internal strife, or simple entropy, as the technologies that sustained them failed and could not be replaced. Terra itself, stripped of resources by millennia of exploitation, watched its orbital elevators collapse and its great cities crumble as the infrastructure that had sustained billions of people simply fell apart. What emerged from the ruins was a nightmare. The survivors of Terra's collapse fractured into thousands of competing factions, each controlling a small territory and defending it jealously against all others. These were not nations in any conventional sense. They were survival groups, barely organized collections of people clinging to whatever scraps of technology and resources they could control. Some were ruled by warlords who had seized power through force of arms. Others were theocratic states, where priests claimed divine authority and demanded absolute obedience. Still others were controlled by techno-clans who hoarded ancient knowledge and used it to maintain their dominance over their territories. The rulers of these factions were known collectively as the techno-barbarians, a term that captures both their primitive brutality and their command of fragmentary technologies from better times. They fought their wars with a mix of ancient weapons, scavenged from the ruins, and crude replicas manufactured in makeshift forges. Laser weapons and plasma guns stood beside rusted swords and cobbled together firearms. Suits of powered armor, carefully maintained across generations, were worn by warriors who could barely read and who understood nothing of the principles that made their equipment function. It was a dark age in the truest sense, a time when humanity had access to the tools of an advanced civilization, but lacked the knowledge or resources to use them properly. The wars between these factions were constant and brutal. Resources were scarce, and every scrap of food, every drop of clean water, every functioning piece of technology was worth fighting for. But these were not wars of conquest in any meaningful sense. There was no grand strategy, no attempt to build something better from the ashes of what had been lost. These were wars of survival and petty dominance, waged by rulers who could think no further ahead than the next season or the next year. Entire regions were rendered uninhabitable by chemical weapons and atomics, the poisons seeping into the soil and water to ensure that the land would remain barren for centuries. Populations were enslaved wholesale, worked to death in mines or manufactories, and then discarded when they could labor no more. And through it all, the ruins of the old world stood as silent witnesses. The great cities of the age of technology had been built to last, constructed with materials and techniques that even the collapse of civilization could not completely erase. But they had been savaged by time and war, their towers broken, their foundations cracked, their systems dead or dying. The techno-barbarians made their fortresses in these ruins, squatting in the bones of a civilization they could not hope to match, scavenging from the dead past to fuel their wars in the present. Some regions of Terra fared worse than others. The Nordafric region, once a breadbasket that fed billions, had been turned into a radioactive desert, where mutant tribes fought over the dried-up remnants of ancient aquifers. The regions that would later be known as Europa were divided among dozens of petty kingdoms, each one barely able to sustain its population and constantly at war with its neighbors. The areas that had once been the most densely populated, the megacities of Eurasia and the sprawling urban complexes of the ancient Pan-Pacific region, were now labyrinths of crumbling structures where savage gangs hunted each other through the ruins, and cannibalism was not uncommon. It was in this context that certain powers began to emerge, techno-barbarian states that were more successful than others, that managed to expand their territories and establish something approaching stable governance. The Indonesic bloc controlled vast swathes of the Pacific region, ruling through a combination of military might and the monopoly they maintained on certain critical technologies. The ethnarchy held dominion over parts of what had been Africa, maintaining order through a rigid caste system and brutal enforcement of their laws. The Achaemenid Empire stretched across the regions, once known as Persia and the Middle East, its rulers claiming descent from ancient dynasties and using that claimed legitimacy to justify their absolute power. And then there was Ursh, perhaps the most powerful and certainly the most terrifying of all the techno-barbarian states. Ursh dominated much of what had been northern Eurasia, controlling territory that stretched from the ruins of ancient Russia to the mountains of the east. It was ruled by a being known as Calagan of Ursh, a tyrant whose cruelty was legendary, even in an age of routine atrocity. Calagan's regime practiced ritual human sacrifice on a massive scale, offerings to dark powers that the ruler claimed gave him strength. Entire populations were worked to death in labor camps, their bodies rendered down for whatever materials could be extracted. The state maintained itself through a combination of terror and the judicious application of ancient weapons that could level cities if Calagan's authority was challenged. But even Ursh, for all its power and horror, was dwarfed by some of the other nightmares that lurked in Terra's ruins. There were things in the deep places of the earth, genetic abominations created by the biocults of the age of technology and left to breed and mutate in the darkness. There were rogue AI systems still operating in hidden bunkers, their original programming corrupted beyond recognition, and their actions driven by logic that bore no relation to human concerns. There were psychers, individuals born with the ability to touch the warp, who had no training or understanding of their powers, and who frequently became hosts for the entities that lurked in that realm of madness. This was Terra at the end of the Age of Strife. This was the world the Emperor found when he emerged from whatever hiding place had sheltered him during humanity's darkest hours. And this was the world that had to be conquered, unified by force of arms and will, before the Great Crusade could even begin. The Unification Wars. The Emperor appeared openly for the first time in the late 29th millennium, revealing himself as a warlord of unprecedented power who commanded an army unlike anything the techno-barbarians had seen. His Thunder Warriors were genetically enhanced super soldiers, prototype space marines who combined inhuman strength and resilience with advanced weapons and armor. They were not invincible, but they were as close to it as made no difference when facing the scattered armies of the techno-barbarian states. A single Thunder Warrior could slaughter dozens of normal soldiers. A company of them could break an army. The Emperor wielded them like a surgeon's scalpel, striking at key targets and crushing any resistance before it could organize. But the Thunder Warriors were only the most visible part of the Emperor's forces. Behind them came the first elements of the Imperial army, regular humans equipped with standardized weapons and organized in military formations that hadn't been seen on Terra for thousands of years. Behind them came the first Custodian Guard, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, warriors who had been crafted by the Emperor's own hand to be even more formidable than the Thunder Warriors. And behind them came something else, something that most citizens of Terra never saw, but that struck terror into those who did. The Emperor himself possessed powers that bordered on the miraculous, abilities that allowed him to kill with a gesture or remake the very substance of reality around him. The Unification Wars were not a single conflict, but rather a series of campaigns spread across decades, as the Emperor systematically conquered or destroyed every power that stood against him. Some factions surrendered quickly, recognizing that resistance was futile and hoping to preserve something of their autonomy in exchange for their submission. Others fought to the bitter end, either out of pride or fear of what the Emperor's victory would mean, or simple unwillingness to accept that their world was ending. The wars were brutal beyond measure, conducted with a ruthlessness that made the techno-barbarian conflicts look almost restrained by comparison. The Emperor's stated goal was unity, the forging of a single human government that could stand against the darkness of the galaxy. But the reality of how that unity was achieved was something far grimmer. Entire populations were purged when they refused to accept imperial rule, or when they were deemed too corrupted by mutation or chaos taint to be salvaged. Ancient monuments and cultural artifacts were destroyed when they conflicted with the imperial truth, the atheistic ideology that the Emperor was imposing on humanity. Religious institutions were systematically eradicated, their practitioners given the choice to renounce their faith or die. The last church on Terra, the Cathedral of the Lightning Stone, was personally destroyed by the Emperor himself in the final days of the unification, a symbolic act that sent a clear message about the new order that was being established. Some of the campaigns were straightforward military operations. The conquest of Albia, for instance, saw the Emperor's forces clash with the Ironsides, proto-dreadnoughts piloted by the warriors of the Albion clans. The fighting was fierce and the casualties heavy on both sides, but eventually the Albion leaders agreed to a diplomatic solution. The Emperor appeared before them in person, unarmed and speaking of his vision for a united humanity, and the clan lords were swayed by his words and by the obvious futility of continued resistance. Albia submitted, and its warriors became some of the most zealous supporters of the Imperium, eager to prove their loyalty to the master they had once opposed. Other campaigns were far darker. The war against Ursh saw the deployment of weapons that had not been used since the age of technology, devices that could crack continents and boil oceans. Caligan's regime had to be utterly destroyed, not merely defeated, because the taint of chaos ran too deep in its structures to be purged. When the Emperor's forces finally broke through to Caligan's stronghold, they found horrors that defied description. Temples where thousands had been sacrificed to appease dark gods. Laboratories where genetic experiments had created things that should never have existed. Records of atrocities so systematic and widespread that they represented a calculated assault on everything that could be called human. Caligan himself was killed by the Emperor, and his empire was burned to ashes. Its people scattered, and its lands left desolate as a warning to others who might contemplate similar paths. The conquest of the ethnarchy revealed a different kind of horror. This was a state that had maintained order and even a degree of prosperity, but only through a caste system so rigid that it bordered on genetic engineering. The ruling castes had used their control of technology and resources to reshape themselves into something that was no longer entirely human, while the lower castes were deliberately stunted, their cognitive abilities limited to make them more tractable as workers. The emperor ordered the ethnarchy's leadership eliminated and its systems dismantled, but the damage to its population could not be so easily undone. Generations of selective breeding and genetic manipulation had created groups that could barely function outside the roles they had been designed for. Throughout all of this, the Thunder Warriors served as the Emperor's primary instrument. They fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness, throwing themselves into battle with no thought for their own survival. But they were flawed, their genetic enhancement unstable in ways that the Emperor's subsequent work with the Primarchs and the Space Marines would correct. Thunder Warriors had limited lifespans, their bodies burning out after only a few decades of service. Worse, their aggressive tendencies grew stronger over time, making them difficult to control and prone to violence even when not in combat. They were perfect for the brutal work of the Unification Wars, but they were not suitable for the galaxy-spanning crusade that the Emperor envisioned would follow. So the Emperor made a decision that would haunt the Imperium's history, though few would ever know the truth of it. At the Battle of Mount Ararat, the last major engagement of the Unification Wars, the surviving Thunder Warriors were betrayed by the very master they had served so loyally. Custodian Guard and the newly created Space Marines of the First Legion fell upon them without warning, slaughtering warriors who had conquered a world in the Emperor's name. The official records claim that the Thunder Warriors died gloriously in that final battle, bringing the unification to a close with their heroic sacrifice. But those who were there, those who witnessed what really happened, know a different truth. The Thunder Warriors were murdered because they were no longer useful, and because they knew too much about the methods the Emperor had used to achieve his victory. This pattern of convenient deaths and selective memory editing would continue throughout the early Imperium. Those who had witnessed things that contradicted the narrative the Emperor wanted to establish often found themselves assigned to the most dangerous operations, or simply disappeared from the records entirely. The history of the Unification Wars was carefully curated, with the worst atrocities either attributed to the techno-barbarians or simply omitted entirely. What remained was a sanitized account of a necessary war to unite humanity, with the Emperor portrayed as a reluctant but determined leader who did what had to be done to save his species. But the ancient Dreadnoughts remember. Those who fought in the Unification Wars, who witnessed firsthand the methods used to achieve victory, carry those memories still. They remember the Thunder Warriors' final moments. They remember the purges and the scorched earth tactics. They remember seeing the Emperor order actions that seemed to contradict everything the Imperial truth claimed to stand for. And they remember being told, in ways both subtle and explicit, that these were not things to be shared with later generations. The psychological toll. To understand why ancient dreadnoughts choose not to speak about what they remember, we must first understand the profound psychological damage that comes from millennia of existence within a dreadnought sarcophagus. The human mind, even enhanced as it is in a space marine, was never designed for such a lifespan or such a mode of existence. The consequences of this mismatch between biology and technology are severe and progressive, worsening with each century that passes. The first casualty is almost always the pilot's sense of time. Dyschronometria, the medical term for this condition, manifests as an inability to accurately perceive the passage of time or to place events in proper chronological sequence. For a dreadnought pilot, who may spend 100 years in stasis sleep and then be awakened for a single battle that lasts only hours, the normal markers that humans use to track time become meaningless. The battle they fought last week might have occurred 3 centuries ago. The brothers they remember fighting alongside might have been dead for millennia. Past and present blur together until the pilot cannot be certain what memories are recent and what are ancient. This temporal confusion is compounded by the fragmentary nature of dreadnought consciousness. Each awakening is preceded by a period of disorientation as the pilot's mind reconnects with the machine that serves as their body. Memories from previous awakenings may be accessible, or they may not. The pilot might remember events from 500 years ago with perfect clarity while having no recollection whatsoever of what happened during their last deployment. The mind tries to construct a coherent narrative from these fragments, but the gaps are simply too large. What emerges is not a continuous stream of consciousness, but rather a collection of isolated moments separated by vast gulfs of lost time. The sensory deprivation experienced during stasis sleep contributes its own form of madness. Floating in the amniotic fluid of the sarcophagus, cut off from all external input, the pilot experiences a kind of existence that has no parallel in normal life. It is not sleep in any conventional sense, because there are no dreams, no periods of REM activity to process the day's events. It is not unconsciousness either, because some level of awareness persists. A dim background hum of minimal neural activity that never quite goes dark. It is something in between, a twilight state that might last years or centuries, where the pilot exists in a kind of sensory void that slowly erodes their grip on reality. When awakened from this state, many dreadnoughts experience vivid hallucinations. They might see brothers who have been dead for centuries standing before them. They might believe they are still fighting in battles that ended long ago. They might hear voices that no one else can hear or perceive threats that don't exist. The tech priests who maintain the dreadnoughts have learned to expect this, giving the pilots time to fully reconnect with their bodies and reorient themselves to the present before deploying them into combat. But the hallucinations never entirely go away. They lurk at the edges of consciousness, ready to resurface whenever the pilot's focus wavers. The isolation is perhaps the worst aspect of dreadnought existence. Cut off from the simple pleasures that make life bearable, unable to feel the warmth of the sun or taste food or experience physical touch, the pilot exists in a prison of their own body. They can communicate through vox speakers, their voices translated into mechanical approximations that bear little resemblance to their original tones. They can see through optical sensors that reduce the world to data readouts and targeting reticules. But they cannot truly connect with the world around them or with the brothers who serve alongside them. They are fundamentally alone, observers trapped behind layers of metal and ceramite. This isolation is made worse by the inexorable march of time. Every time a dreadnought awakens, it is to a world that has moved on without them. Brothers they fought alongside are dead or elevated to positions of authority they barely recognize. The chapter's traditions and practices have evolved in ways that seem alien and strange. The very language has shifted, new words and phrases entering common use while old ones fall away. The dreadnought finds themselves increasingly disconnected from the organization they once belonged to, a relic from a past that grows more distant with each awakening. Some pilots cope with this by deliberately suppressing their memories of who they were before their entombment. They embrace the role of the dreadnought fully, defining themselves entirely by their function as weapons rather than trying to maintain a connection to their former identity. These pilots often become the most stable over long periods, having sacrificed their humanity in exchange for a kind of mechanical serenity. They can serve for millennia without losing coherence, but the price they pay is the loss of everything that once made them individuals. Others attempt to maintain their sense of self, clinging desperately to memories of their former lives and relationships. These pilots suffer more acutely from the passage of time, feeling the weight of every loss and every change. They experience something akin to chronic grief, mourning not just for the brothers who have died, but for their own lost humanity. Many of these pilots eventually succumb to madness, their minds fragmenting, under the strain of trying to hold on to something that time and circumstance have made impossible to retain. And then there are those who occupy a middle ground, who remember who they were but have learned to accept what they have become. These are often the wisest of the ancients, the ones whose counsel is most valued by their chapters. They have achieved a kind of detachment that allows them to view events with perspective that comes from having witnessed centuries of history. But this detachment comes with its own costs. They no longer feel emotions with the same intensity they once did. Love, hate, joy, fear, all of these become muted, experienced at a remove as if through a filter. They observe their own psychological state with a clinical eye, noting the progress of their deterioration without being able to prevent it. For those ancient dreadnoughts who served in the Unification Wars and the early Great Crusade, all of these problems are magnified by the sheer span of time they have existed. 10,000 years is an inconceivable expanse for a human consciousness to traverse. The mind simply was not built for it. That any coherent personality survives at all across such a gulf is a testament to the resilience of the Space Marine psyche and the sophistication of the Dreadnoughts' life support systems. But survival is not the same as remaining unchanged. These ancient warriors are not the same beings they were when they were first entombed. They have been worn down and reshaped by time and trauma until what remains is something harder and colder than what they began as. This transformation affects how they relate to their memories of Terra's past, the atrocities they witnessed during the Unification Wars, the methods used to forge the Imperium. These experiences were traumatic at the time, but 10,000 years of service, 10,000 years of witnessing the constant horror of the 41st millennium has given them a context that makes those early traumas seem almost quaint by comparison. They have seen whole worlds burned for showing the slightest taint of chaos. They have witnessed the Inquisition's work firsthand, the systematic purges, and the willingness to sacrifice millions to save billions. They have fought in wars where the only options were victory or extermination. From this perspective, the brutality of the Unification Wars becomes understandable, even justifiable. The Emperor did what was necessary to unite humanity and prepare it for the Great Crusade. The methods were harsh, but the alternative was humanity remaining fractured and weak, easy prey for the Xenos and chaos. The ancient dreadnoughts have seen what happens to human worlds that lack the Imperium's protection. They understand, in a way that younger generations cannot, why the Emperor made the choices he did. But understanding is not the same as acceptance, and acceptance is not the same as wanting to share that understanding with others. The ancient dreadnoughts carry their memories of Terra's past as a burden, a weight that has only grown heavier with time. And they have learned, through centuries of observation, that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. What they remember but won't say. The ancient dreadnoughts who fought in the Unification Wars remember Terra as it truly was, stripped of the mythology that has grown up around it in the 10,000 years since. They remember the scale of the atrocities, the systematic nature of the purges, the calculated brutality that was employed to break resistance and ensure compliance. These are not vague memories or impressions. These are detailed recollections of specific events, of orders given and carried out, of methods that were used to achieve the Emperor's goals. They remember the early Thunder Warrior deployments, before the Emperor had perfected the genetic enhancements that would later be used in the Space Marines. They remember seeing brothers in arms succumb to cellular instability, their enhanced bodies literally tearing themselves apart from the inside. They remember being ordered to put these failed experiments down when they became too unstable to control, killing warriors who had fought loyally but whose biology had betrayed them. And they remember being told that this was necessary, that the perfection of the Emperor's work required sacrifice, and that those sacrifices must not be questioned. They remember the purges of the religious institutions, not as the clean break with superstition that official histories describe, but as systematic campaigns of cultural genocide. Temples were burned with their priests still inside. Faithful who refused to renounce their beliefs were executed en masse. Sacred texts that had survived thousands of years were fed to incinerators. The ancient Dreadnoughts watched all of this happen and participated in it, following orders that came directly from the Emperor or from his most trusted commanders. They witnessed the transition from a Terra where thousands of different belief systems coexisted in uneasy peace to one where only the imperial truth was permitted. They remember what happened to populations that were deemed too mutated or too corrupted to be salvaged. Not the quick mercy of a bolt round, but systematic extermination, followed by complete eradication of any evidence that these populations had ever existed. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, their inhabitants killed to the last child, their names struck from what few records remained. This was not done in the heat of battle or as a response to immediate threats. This was planned and methodical, carried out with the cold efficiency that would later characterize the Imperium's response to all deviance from the acceptable human norm. They remember the fate of the Selena gene cults on Luna, the first conquest beyond Terra proper. These were the groups that had preserved much of the biological knowledge from the dark age of technology, the skills that would be essential for creating the Primarchs and the Space Marines. After their conquest, their knowledge was seized and incorporated into the Emperor's work, but the cultists themselves were not permitted to retain their independence. Those who cooperated were absorbed into the early mechanicum. Those who resisted or who were deemed too dangerous to keep alive simply disappeared, their bodies disposed of in ways that left no trace. They remember seeing the Emperor unleash powers that seemed to violate the very laws of physics, abilities that appeared indistinguishable from sorcery, despite his insistence that everything he did was based on science and reason. They watched him burn entire army formations with fire that seemed to spring from nothing. They saw him reshape the genetic code of his Thunder Warriors with a gesture and a moment of concentration. They witnessed him doing things that would later be classified as witchcraft and forbidden under penalty of death when ordinary humans attempted them. The cognitive dissonance of watching the Emperor employ warp-based powers while simultaneously prosecuting a crusade against all forms of psychic activity was profound, and it was never adequately explained. They remember the creation of the Primarchs, though the exact details were kept secret even from most who served in the early Imperium. They knew that the Emperor was working on something monumental beneath the Himalaysian mountains, something that required vast resources and the efforts of the most skilled geneticists and bioengineers Terra could provide. They heard rumors of the scattering of the Primarchs, though whether this was an accident or served some larger purpose known only to the Emperor remained unclear. And they were present when the Primarchs began to be rediscovered during the early Great Crusade, watching as the Emperor reunited with sons he had not seen since they were infants. Most significantly, they remember the Thunder Warriors' final fate. The ancient Dreadnoughts know that the Thunder Warriors were not killed in glorious battle at Mount Ararat, as the official histories claim. They were systematically betrayed and murdered by warriors they had fought alongside, killed because the Emperor deemed them too unstable and too knowledgeable to be permitted to survive into the new era. Some of the oldest Dreadnoughts may have participated in this betrayal themselves, following orders they found distasteful but could not refuse. They carry the guilt of that participation, a stain on their honor that can never be washed away, no matter how many millennia of service they render. They remember conversations with the Emperor himself, back when he still walked among his warriors and led them personally in battle. They remember him speaking of his vision for humanity's future, of a galaxy unified under human rule and cleansed of the Xenos taint. But they also remember him speaking in more private moments, when the mask of the perfect leader slipped and revealed glimpses of something older and more complex. They remember him expressing doubts about whether his plan would work, whether humanity could be saved from itself, whether the costs he was paying were justified by the potential benefits. These moments of vulnerability were rare, but they occurred, and those who witnessed them have never forgotten. They remember the early Space Marines, the warriors of the First Legion who were deployed even before the Primarchs were recovered. These were the Proto-Astartes, less stable than what would come later, but far superior to the Thunder Warriors they were replacing. The ancient Dreadnoughts watched the transition from one generation of super soldiers to the next, noting the improvements, but also recognizing the continuity in methods. The Emperor was still creating weapons, still sacrificing individuals in pursuit of a larger goal, still making decisions that prioritized the survival of humanity as a species over the rights or welfare of any particular human. And they remember the lies, not lies of omission or diplomatic half-truths, but outright fabrications designed to reshape how the unification wars would be remembered. They watched as events were rewritten, as inconvenient facts were eliminated from the records, as the narrative of a righteous crusade to unite humanity was constructed from the raw material of a far messier reality. They saw the Emperor and his advisors make conscious decisions about what would be remembered and what would be forgotten, understanding that controlling the past was essential to controlling the future. These memories are the burden that ancient Dreadnoughts carry. They know the truth about the Imperium's founding, the blood price that was paid to create the unity that made the Great Crusade possible. They know that the Emperor was not the purely benevolent figure that he is now worshipped as being. They know that the methods used to forge the Imperium were often indistinguishable from the atrocities committed by the enemies that same Imperium now fights against. And they know that speaking these truths aloud would shake the foundations of the only thing holding humanity together in the 41st millennium: the burden of forbidden knowledge. There is a particular kind of horror that comes from possessing knowledge that cannot be shared, from understanding truths that must remain hidden. For the ancient Dreadnoughts who remember Terra's true history, this horror is a constant companion, weighing on them every time they awaken and are asked to share their wisdom with younger generations. They must carefully pass every word, considering not just what is true, but what it is safe to say, what will be helpful rather than destructive, what will strengthen faith rather than undermine it. The fundamental problem is that the Imperium of the 41st millennium is built on mythology, not history. The Emperor is not remembered as a warlord who united Terra through conquest, but as a divine figure whose every action was perfect and just. The Space Marines are not seen as weapons created to serve the Emperor's ambitions, but as angels of death who embody all that is noble about humanity. The early Imperium is portrayed as a golden age of enlightenment and progress, a shining beacon that was tragically extinguished by the Horus heresy. None of these narratives can withstand contact with the messy reality of what actually happened. This gap between myth and reality creates an impossible situation for those who remember the truth. If they speak honestly about the unification wars, they risk destroying the faith that sustains billions of imperial citizens. If they remain silent, they allow lies to become accepted as truth, watching as each generation moves further from understanding the actual foundations upon which their society rests. There is no good choice, only a series of compromises and careful evasions that preserve the broader narrative while withholding the most damaging specifics. The ancient Dreadnoughts have learned to navigate this treacherous ground through centuries of practice. When asked about the Emperor, they speak of his vision and his achievements while carefully avoiding any details that might complicate the worship that has grown up around him. When questioned about the unification wars, they discuss broad strategies and the necessity of unity while omitting the specific methods that were employed. When pressed about their own experiences during this period, they claim that their memories have faded or that such ancient history is less important than the challenges facing the Imperium now. Each evasion is technically truthful while still perpetuating the myths that the Imperium requires. But this constant self-censorship takes a psychological toll. Every conversation becomes an exercise in careful word choice. Every sharing of wisdom requires mental editing to remove dangerous truths. The ancient dreadnoughts must maintain two separate versions of history in their minds simultaneously: the truth of what they witnessed and the official version that they are permitted to acknowledge. Over time, this split consciousness becomes second nature, but it also reinforces their isolation. They cannot truly share their experiences with anyone, because doing so would mean revealing things that must remain hidden. This isolation is particularly acute when dealing with the chapter's librarians and chaplains, the very individuals who are most likely to seek out ancient wisdom. These warriors are intelligent and educated, trained to think critically about history and theology. They ask probing questions and notice inconsistencies. An ancient dreadnought must be especially careful in these conversations, providing enough genuine insight to be valuable while steering clear of topics that could lead to dangerous revelations. It is a delicate balance, one that requires the pilot to remain constantly alert to the implications of every statement they make. The Inquisition represents an additional threat, though one that must be handled with extreme delicacy. Inquisitors have the authority to declare anyone heretical and to extract information through any means necessary. An ancient dreadnought who spoke too freely about the Imperium's founding might find themselves subjected to an investigation, their memories picked apart by psychers and their loyalty questioned. Worse, the chapter that hosts the dreadnought might suffer consequences, marked as potentially corrupted by association with dangerous knowledge. The ancient warriors must be mindful of this, understanding that their silence protects not just themselves, but all those around them. Yet the knowledge they possess is not entirely without use. Within carefully controlled contexts, the ancient dreadnoughts can share insights that help their chapters navigate the complexities of the 41st millennium. They can speak of the Emperor's pragmatism, his willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals, and use this to counsel flexibility when rigid adherence to doctrine might be counterproductive. They can discuss the realities of the Unification War's brutality to prepare younger warriors for the moral ambiguities they will face in service to the Imperium. They can acknowledge that the past was messier than the myths suggest, without going so far as to completely undermine those myths. This careful parceling out of truth is perhaps the ancient dreadnoughts' most important service to their chapters. They serve as a kind of institutional memory that exists outside the official histories, a source of practical wisdom that acknowledges reality without being paralyzed by it. They help their brothers understand that the Imperium has always been an imperfect institution, that moral compromises have been part of its character from the very beginning, and that this does not invalidate the service they provide or the necessity of their continued resistance against the darkness that threatens humanity. But this role as guardian of dangerous truths also means accepting that they can never fully unburden themselves. The complete truth about Terra's past, about the methods the Emperor used, and the price that was paid for unity, must remain locked within their deteriorating minds. They carry this knowledge alone, watching as it slowly erodes along with everything else about them, knowing that when they finally fall in battle or succumb to the ravages of time, much of what they remember will be lost forever. The alternative, speaking openly and risking the consequences, is simply too dangerous to contemplate. There is also a philosophical dimension to their silence. Many ancient dreadnoughts have come to question whether complete historical truth is actually valuable or desirable. They have seen what happens when faith is undermined, how quickly societies can collapse when the narratives that sustain them are revealed as fabrications. They understand that myths serve a purpose, that the stories a civilization tells about itself shape what it becomes. The myth of the Emperor as a perfect being, while false, has helped to create countless generations of warriors willing to sacrifice everything in service to humanity. The myth of the Imperium as humanity's last hope, while simplifying a more complex reality, has unified a fractured species and given it the strength to survive in a hostile galaxy. From this perspective, their silence is not a betrayal of truth, but rather an act of mercy. By allowing the myths to persist, they protect their brothers from knowledge that would only cause pain without providing any corresponding benefit. The younger generations do not need to know every detail of how the Imperium was forged. They need to believe in what it represents, to have faith that their service matters and that the sacrifices they make have meaning. Stripping away that faith in exchange for historical accuracy would not make them better warriors or more effective servants of humanity. It would only make them more prone to doubt and despair. Yet even as they justify their silence to themselves, the ancient dreadnoughts cannot escape a lingering sense of guilt. They are, after all, lying by omission to warriors they have sworn to guide and protect. They are allowing younger generations to believe things that are not true, to worship an ideal that never existed, to serve an institution without understanding its actual foundations. This contradiction between the duty to preserve morale and the obligation to tell truth is never fully resolved. It remains a tension that the ancient ones carry with them through all their centuries of service. Individual examples and stories. Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves epitomizes the complex relationship ancient dreadnoughts have with their memories of Terra's past. Awakened periodically over the past 10 millennia, Bjorn has shared countless stories about Leman Russ and the Great Crusade. He speaks with evident pride about the Wolf King, about the bonds of brotherhood that existed among the early Space Wolves, about battles fought and victories won. But there are notable gaps in his narratives, subjects that he consistently avoids or dismisses with gruff pronouncements that such things are not worth discussing. When asked about the specific circumstances of Russ's disappearance, Bjorn becomes evasive. He will say that the Primarch had his reasons for departing to the Eye of Terra, and that those reasons must remain between Russ and the Emperor. He will speak of the Wolf King's last words to his warriors, but will not elaborate on what private conversations might have occurred before that final departure. There is something in Bjorn's tone during these evasions that suggests he knows more than he says, that he carries knowledge about his Primarch's fate that would be too painful or too dangerous to share. Similarly, when the topic of the Emperor himself comes up, Bjorn is careful in his choice of words. He will describe the Emperor's power and his vision for humanity's future. He will speak of the awe he felt in the Emperor's presence and the sense of purpose that service to such a being provided. But he will not discuss what the Emperor was like as a person, what doubts or fears he might have expressed, what price he knew he was paying for his ambitions. These personal details remain locked away, shared only in the most private conversations with chapter masters, and then only in the vaguest terms. The pattern is consistent across other ancient dreadnoughts as well. Those few who survived from the Unification Wars era have learned similar lessons about what can and cannot be safely discussed. They share stories of battles and brotherhood, while carefully editing out the context that would make those stories problematic. They speak of the necessity of harsh measures without describing those measures in detail. They acknowledge that the past was difficult without explaining exactly how difficult or why. Ancient dreadnoughts of the Blood Angels. Legion who served during the Great Crusade have their own silences. They remember Sanguinius before the heresy, the perfect angel who led them with compassion and wisdom. But they also remember moments that complicate that image, decisions the Primarch made that were ruthless rather than merciful, compromises he accepted that seemed to contradict his stated principles. These contradictions are not shared with the younger Blood Angels, who have built their entire identity around their Primarch's nobility and sacrifice. To reveal that Sanguinius was a more complex figure than the legends suggest would undermine the faith that helps his sons resist the Black Rage. The Dark Angels' most ancient dreadnoughts carry perhaps the heaviest burden of all, for they know the truth about what happened on Caliban, during and after the heresy. They know about the Fallen, about the schism that split the Legion, about the terrible secrets that the chapter has spent 10,000 years trying to bury. But they maintain the same silence as their mobile brothers, understanding that the Dark Angel's obsessive secrecy serves a purpose, even if the original reasons for that secrecy have become less relevant with the passage of time. The Ancient Ones know that some truths, once spoken, cannot be taken back, and that the consequences of revelation might be worse than the consequences of continued deception. There are, however, occasional cracks in this wall of silence. Sometimes an ancient dreadnought, in a moment of weakness or extreme fatigue, will let something slip that they should not. A detail about the Emperor that contradicts official doctrine. A mention of an event that was supposed to have been forgotten. A fragment of conversation overheard millennia ago that reveals uncomfortable truths about the Imperium's founding. These moments are rare, and they are typically followed by desperate efforts to minimize the damage, claiming that the pilot was confused, that their memories are unreliable, that whatever they said should not be taken seriously. In some cases, these slips have led to official action. Ancient dreadnoughts who spoke too freely have been subjected to examination by chaplains and inquisitors, their memories probed for heretical taint. The results of these investigations are inevitably that the pilot's mind has deteriorated to the point where their testimony is unreliable, allowing the dangerous revelation to be dismissed and forgotten. But the investigation itself serves as a warning to other Ancient Ones about the consequences of failing to maintain proper discretion. There are also stories, impossible to verify, of ancient dreadnoughts who chose a different path. Warriors who decided that the truth was more important than the myths, who began to speak openly about what they had witnessed during the Unification Wars and the early Imperium. These stories always end the same way, with the dreadnought being destroyed in suspicious circumstances, their chapter claiming that they fell in battle or that a catastrophic systems failure occurred. Whether these stories are true or merely cautionary tales spread among the Ancient Ones to reinforce the importance of silence, they serve their purpose. The ancient dreadnoughts understand that there are limits to what will be tolerated, lines that cannot be crossed without facing terminal consequences. The loneliness of maintaining this silence is perhaps the greatest burden these ancient warriors bear. They exist in a kind of temporal exile, cut off from meaningful connection with their brothers by the gulf of time and knowledge that separates them. They can speak, but they cannot truly communicate. They can share, but they cannot be honest. They can guide, but they cannot fully explain the lessons they have learned. This isolation compounds the physical isolation of dreadnought existence, creating a double barrier between the pilot and the world around them. And yet, for all their suffering and isolation, the ancient dreadnoughts continue to serve. They awaken when called, they share what wisdom they can safely impart, and they fight when required. They do this not because they have any illusions about the Imperium being perfect, or about their service being rewarded. They do it because they understand, better than anyone, what the alternative would be. They have seen what humanity was like when it was fractured and weak. They know what threatens humanity from the darkness between the stars. And they have decided, through centuries of service and sacrifice, that maintaining the myths that hold the Imperium together is worth the personal cost of carrying truths that cannot be spoken. The tragedy of eternal service. The ancient dreadnoughts represent a unique tragedy within the already grimdark setting of Warhammer 40,000. They are warriors who have been granted a form of immortality, but at the cost of everything that makes life worth living. They have become living weapons, stripped of agency and reduced to their function as instruments of war. They have watched everyone they knew turn to dust, witnessed the slow corruption of everything they fought to build, and experienced the gradual erosion of their own minds as the centuries pile up like snow on a grave. Their existence is a stark illustration of the Imperium's fundamental ethos. That individual suffering is irrelevant compared to the collective need for survival. A dreadnought pilot's desires, their pain, their longing for rest, none of these matter when weighed against the military value they provide. They are tools to be used until they break, and if their minds deteriorate along the way, well, That is an acceptable cost for maintaining the Imperium's military strength. The very fact of their continued existence is a kind of violence, a refusal to grant mercy to warriors who have more than earned the right to true death. But within this tragedy lies a deeper question. What does it mean to serve? The ancient dreadnoughts have served far longer than any human should be asked to serve. They have given centuries, millennia, of their existence to the defense of humanity. At what point does service become suffering? At what point does duty become cruelty? These are questions that the Imperium's ideology cannot answer, because to engage with them seriously would require acknowledging that the system itself is fundamentally unjust. The Ancient Ones themselves have long since moved beyond such questions. They serve because that is what they are now, because their identity has been so thoroughly consumed by their function that they can no longer conceive of being anything else. The choice to serve is not really a choice when you have forgotten what else you could be. This loss of self is perhaps the final stage of their tragedy, not just that they suffer, but that they have lost the capacity to recognize their suffering as something that might be otherwise. Their silence about Terra's past is part of this same tragedy. They carry knowledge that could reshape the Imperium's understanding of its own history, but they cannot share it because doing so would undermine the very system that has consumed their lives. They are trapped by their own service, unable to question or challenge the institution they have sacrificed everything for. The truths they know about the Emperor's methods, about the real costs of the unification wars, about the lies that were told to create the Imperium's foundation myths, all of this remains locked within minds that are slowly failing, destined to die with them when their sarcophagi finally fall silent. There is a particular cruelty in this. Not only must the ancient dreadnoughts endure millennia of physical and psychological torment, but they must do so knowing that even their memories, their last connection to their original humanity, will serve no greater purpose. They cannot pass on the full truth to younger generations. They cannot ensure that the lessons of the past are properly learned. They cannot even speak honestly to their brothers about what they have witnessed and what it has cost them. They exist in enforced silence, watching history repeat itself because they are not permitted to explain how it actually happened the first time. The ancient dreadnoughts also face the slow recognition that the Imperium they helped to create has become something they would not have chosen to serve. The Imperium of the 41st Millennium is far more brutal, far more repressive, far more divorced from reason and enlightenment than what the Emperor originally envisioned. The imperial truth has been replaced by religious fanaticism. The pursuit of human advancement has been replaced by desperate stagnation. The hope of a galaxy united under human rule has been replaced by the grim reality of endless war against overwhelming odds. The Ancient Ones watch all of this unfold over the centuries and understand that they helped to build a prison for humanity, not a paradise. But they cannot speak this truth either. To acknowledge that the Imperium has failed, that it has become a tyranny that perpetuates human suffering rather than alleviating it, would be heresy of the highest order. So the ancient dreadnoughts maintain their silence about this as well, choking down observations that might inspire doubt or resistance. They counsel younger warriors to serve faithfully, while knowing that faithful service perpetuates a system that grinds humanity into dust as surely as any Xenos invasion or Chaos incursion would. The tragedy is complete when we recognize that the ancient dreadnoughts have no escape. They cannot choose to die because their bodies are too thoroughly integrated with the life support systems of their sarcophagi. They cannot retire from service because their chapters consider them too valuable to waste. They cannot speak the truth because doing so would bring consequences down, not just on themselves but on everyone around them. They are trapped in every possible way, physically, psychologically, politically, morally. Their existence has become a kind of hell, and there is no exit. And yet, despite all of this, they continue. When the call comes, when their chapter needs them, they awaken from stasis and march to war once more. They do this knowing that each battle might be their last, but also knowing that it probably will not be, that they will survive to be returned to the darkness for another century or two before the cycle repeats. They do this without hope of reward or recognition, without any illusion that their sacrifice will ultimately matter in the vast sweep of the galaxy's history. They do it because it is what they are, because service is the only thing they have left, because the alternative, succumbing to madness or despair, is a betrayal of every brother who fell before them. This is the ultimate tragedy of the ancient dreadnoughts, that they have been so thoroughly dehumanized by their service that they can no longer conceive of being anything other than servants. They are prisoners who have forgotten what freedom looks like, slaves who have internalized their chains so completely that they no longer feel the weight. And they maintain their silence about Terra's past, not out of noble discretion, but because they have been so conditioned by millennia of service that they cannot imagine acting otherwise. A legacy of silence. In the end, the reason ancient dreadnoughts won't describe what Terra used to be is not a single explanation, but a constellation of factors that all point toward the same conclusion. The truth is too dangerous to speak. Dangerous for the Imperium, whose foundation myths would crumble if the reality of the unification wars were widely known. Dangerous for the chapters, who would face investigation and possible censure if their ancients spoke too freely. Dangerous for the ancient ones themselves, who would be eliminated if they became too much of a liability. And dangerous for the younger generations, who might lose the faith that sustains them in an otherwise unbearable existence. The ancient dreadnoughts carry the full weight of the Imperium's history within their deteriorating minds. They remember what humanity was like at its lowest point, when the age of strife had reduced the cradle of civilization to a wasteland ruled by tyrants and monsters. They witnessed the Emperor's rise and the brutal methods he used to forge unity from chaos. They saw the Thunder Warrior's betrayal and the careful construction of new myths to replace the messy reality. They watched as the Imperium transformed from a rationalist empire based on science and reason into a theocratic nightmare sustained by faith and fear. All of this knowledge accumulated across centuries of service has taught them a fundamental lesson, that the truth of the past does not serve the needs of the present. The Imperium requires its myths to function. Without the myth of the Emperor's divinity, billions of citizens would have no reason to endure their suffering. Without the myth of the Great Crusade's nobility, the Space Marines might question whether their sacrifices have meaning. Without the myth that the Imperium represents humanity's best hope, resistance to its authority might seem justified. The ancient dreadnoughts understand that truth and utility are not the same thing, and they have chosen utility. But this choice has cost them dearly. They have become repositories of forbidden knowledge, living proof that the Imperium's official histories are sanitized lies. They exist in a state of permanent tension, knowing truths they cannot share, watching as each generation moves further from understanding the actual foundations of their society. They are custodians of a history that will die with them, witnesses to events that the Imperium has decided should be forgotten. Their silence is both their service and their punishment, a burden they will carry until the day their sarcophagi finally fail, and they are granted the death they have earned 1,000 times over. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, the ancient dreadnoughts stand as monuments to a past that must not be remembered. They are living lies, testaments to a history that has been rewritten, guardians of truths too dangerous to speak aloud. And when the last of them falls, when the final ancient warrior succumbs to the erosion of time and the accumulated damage of 10,000 years of service, the truth about Terra's past will die with them. The myths will win, as myths always do, because myths serve the living while truth serves only itself. This is why ancient dreadnoughts won't describe what Terra used to be, not because they have forgotten, though their memories are fragmentary and confused, not because they don't care, though their capacity for emotion has been dulled by millennia of psychological trauma, but because they have learned, through centuries of painful experience, that some truths are more dangerous than any enemy, and that sometimes the greatest service one can render is to carry knowledge to the grave rather than speaking it into the light. So remember, if you ever have the privilege of speaking with an ancient dreadnought, if you ever stand before one of these walking tombs and hear the mechanical rasp of their voice, do not ask them about Terra before the unification. Do not inquire about the Emperor's methods or the Thunder Warrior's fate or the true cost of forging the Imperium. They will not answer you honestly, and the lies they tell, through evasion, through selective memory, through careful omission, are among the greatest services they can still render to the humanity they have served for so impossibly long. Their silence is their gift to the Imperium. Their burden is their legacy. And when the last of them falls, fighting to the end as they have always fought, that gift will be complete. The truth about Terra's past will be lost forever, buried beneath 10,000 years of mythology and propaganda. And the Imperium will march on, sustained by its lies, crushing its enemies beneath the weight of its ignorance, never knowing what sacrifices were made to create the foundation upon which it stands. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and in that endless war, truth is the first casualty, silence is the only wisdom, and the ancient dreadnoughts who remember how it all began will carry their secrets into the darkness that awaits us all. If you found this deep dive into the lore of Warhammer 40,000 enlightening, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. The Ancient Ones have spoken, in their silence, of truths we were never meant to hear. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and some memories are too terrible to share.